So welcome to the first video in the Pleasant Vices series. I'm Tasha Marks and I'm a food historian and artist. So today I'm with Dr. Jennifer Evans and we're looking at aphrodisiacs.
I've been studying aphrodisiacs in the early modern period, so in the 17th and 18th centuries, since around 2008. And my first book was on aphrodisiacs, which was published in 2014.
Historically, aphrodisiacs were not just recreational, they were functional. Historically, aphrodisiacs were cures for infertility as much as anything else, so they had a functional purpose.
Yeah, in the 17th century, the way that they understood sex and reproduction meant that both men and women needed to experience sexual pleasure and desire in order for conception to happen, so it was really important to get that kind of balance right. Medical theory in the early modern period was very much influenced by religion, and it was suggested that after Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, God imbued every single plant in the world with a particular characteristic that showed what its medical virtue was. So we end up with plants like strawberries being associated with women's bodies and men's bodies being associated with carrots and any other phallic-shaped vegetables.
Or asparagus. I think if you have a dirty enough mind, anything could be an aphrodisiac.
Absolutely.
The other thing was, as well, food in itself is a very sensuous activity. If you've ever factored a date's choice of restaurant or their ability to cook into your choice to go home with them, then that's the aphrodisiac qualities of food at work. Food is about the senses and about taste and texture and smell. It is a sensual activity. So when we think of aphrodisiacs, we often think of luxury foods like lobsters and oysters and things like that, but historically those are not the most interesting ones. And at some point in history, everything on this table was considered an aphrodisiac. And the early modern period saw the rise of the kitchen physic, people who could just whip up a remedy from things that were readily available, things in the garden or in the hedgerows. Or if you did have a little bit more money, there were some very interesting aphrodisiacs on the market which you could purchase.
Yeah, in the 18th century, you get the rise of what are described as patent medicines, things that you can buy ready-made that are sent to you that advertised widely in the newspapers. And one of my absolute favourites is the prolific elixir. They described it as a medicine of inestimable worth for curing barrenness in women and imbecility in men, and endowed the body with a balmy warmth and moisture, and thereby rejuvenated the whole body to such an extent that it would make everyone prolific, as it suggested in the title.
So it might be strange to sound like you wanted to be warm and balmy, but this was also an era where the body was, medical discourse was focused around the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. And the balance of these within an individual's body would make up their individual constitution.
And in fact, the most important features of the four humours for reproduction is to be warm and moist. A body that is cold was described as a body that was frigid, unable to feel pleasure and unable to conceive. And you want a bit of moisture because a body that's too dry was seen as inappropriate, would dry out the seed and stop a conception happening.
Yeah, so they thought the seed was made from salty particles from the blood. So the idea of being both salty and warm and balmy was the ultimate, I suppose, the ultimate aphrodisiac after all. And if we think about words like salacious, the sal in salacious is thought to come from salt. So salt being the ultimate aphrodisiac.
Perhaps one of the most interesting aphrodisiacs suggested in the 17th century was for those people whose bodies were already warm, and so you didn't want to overheat the body. And so they are offered what come to be called windy meats. This encompasses peas, beans, chickpeas and nuts. And it might sound like the least sexy of foods you could possibly eat, but in the 17th century they believed that men's bodies need wind in order to be able to work sexually. So any food that releases wind into the body is seen as particularly appropriate for encouraging sexual activity. My favourite quote in a medical text ever for explaining why they work, which says that the male member needs to be blown up like a windsock.
Wow. Yeah. So windy meats were things like beans and peas. So we have our beans on the table here. The other thing that was considered an aphrodisiac in the early modern period were potatoes, not because of any particular quality of them, but because they'd only been introduced to England in the 1600s, and as a new object people just tried to sell them as an aphrodisiac. It was a sort of tagline. So next time you have a jacket potato with baked beans, you'll think about it very differently. It never seems so sexy. Of the core historical aphrodisiacs, ones that appear in many texts throughout history, not just the early modern period, are milk, nuts and honey. Many nuts are considered aphrodisiacs for their relationship to the seed. And in the Victorian era, going a-nutting was a euphemism for fornication, not just because of this aphrodisiac link, but also because it gave men and women an excuse to go off into the woods alone together. So one of the more unusual historical aphrodisiacs is ambergris. I have it here, that little lump in there is the ambergris, which has been left in sugar. And ambergris comes from the stomach of a sperm whale. It's a build-up of the undigested squid beaks which the whales feed on. It builds up in the whale's stomach and is expelled one way or another. And it floats out at sea, fossilising into a sort of oceanic truffle until one day, maybe 50 to 100 years later, it washes up on the beach and people go hunting for it. And this sort of smelly looking rock might not sound like much, but per gram it's worth more than gold. So it's one of the most expensive ingredients. Its mystery and its cost is part of the reason why historically it was considered an aphrodisiac. And we found it in lots of different recipes for the time. I find it really funny that medical Renaissance idea that religion was linked to medicine, so that God left clues behind when Adam and Eve were pushed out of the Garden of Eden. That's coming back now. I've seen it on Instagram where they have, to eat walnuts for your brain or eat kidney beans for your kidneys, and that whole idea of aphrodisiacs being resemblant of sexual body parts, that is still very much prevalent today. So thank you for watching. If you've liked what you've seen, you can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe to the British Museum YouTube channel here.